In this video we shall discuss how to use triggers to correct data on the fly. In the first task we have to create a trigger to check if there is a dot at the end of subscriber's name and to add such a dot if there is no one. The expected result is that the data correction should be performed on attempt to violate that rule. And also a message should be displayed to describe the situation, and this message may look like this. Again and again in MySQL we have to create two triggers with exactly the same code, because this DBMS does not allow to assign a trigger to several different operations. So our first trigger will react to insert operation. Inside the trigger for each row we shall check this condition. And unlike in many previous tasks, if that condition is violated, we shall not abort the transaction. Instead, we shall do the following. We shall produce new subscriber's name, we shall produce information message, then we shall use that new value of a subscriber's name to insert into the database. And finally we shall execute this command with such parameters, and execution that command with these parameters will not lead to transaction rollback. The second trigger for MySQL will react to update operation, and the only difference here is this word. The whole other code is exactly the same as we've seen a couple of seconds ago. Of course, in Microsoft SQL Server we may assign one trigger to different operations, but here we shall follow MySQL approach to simplify the code. So the first trigger is instead of insert one. First we have to produce the list of records that violate that rule. Then we have to check if this list is empty or not, and if it's not, we have to produce the information message, print that message and raise an error, but we shall not abort the transaction. And finally we have to perform the insert operation, and here in this block of code we are checking for that condition, and if the dot is missing at the end of subscriber's name, we are adding that dot there. The second trigger for Microsoft SQL Server is instead of update one. First we have to check if the query that activated the trigger is updating the primary key of our table. If that's so, we have to roll back the transaction, otherwise we cannot perform that operation. Then we have to compose the list of records that violate that rule. And if that list is not empty, we have to produce the information message, we have to print that message, and we have to raise an error, but we shall not roll back the transaction. And finally, we have to perform the update operation. And here we are once again checking for that condition, and if the dot is missing at the end of subscriber's name, we are adding that dot there. Finally, with Oracle the solution is that simple. We have only one trigger for both insert and update operations. Inside the trigger's body for each row we are checking for this condition that comes from the task. If that condition is violated, we have to compose the new value for subscriber's name. Then we have to compose the information message and print it using such command. And finally we are using that value to insert to the database. In the second task, we have to create a trigger to change the subscription end date to current date plus 2 months, if the given end date is in the past or is less than the start date. The expected result is that data correction should be performed on attempt to violate that rule, and also a message should be displayed to describe the situation, and that message may look like this. Once again, for MySQL we have to create two exactly the same triggers for that reason. So the first trigger will react to insert operation. And inside its body for each row we shall check for this condition that comes from the task. If that condition is violated, we have to calculate the new subscription's end date, we have to produce the information message, then we have to use this new value to insert to the database, and then we have to execute this command with such parameters that will not lead to transaction rollback. One can easily guess that the second trigger will only differ from the previous one with this single word. And of course the whole trigger's body is exactly the same as with the previous trigger. In Microsoft SQL Server the first trigger is instead of insert one. As usual, we create a list of records that violate that rule. Of course, this block of code may be rewritten using string egg function, but please do it yourself. Then we have to check if this list of bad records is empty or not. If it's not, we have to produce this information message, we have to print it, and we have to raise an error situation, but we shall not roll back the transaction. And finally, we have to perform the insert operation. We have to allow identity insert on our table, we have to deal with the primary key, it has to calculate its value if the primary key passed to the query is empty. In this block of code, we have once again to check for that condition, and if that condition is violated, we have to modify that date. Finally, the insert operation itself happens, and then we only have to disallow the identity insert on our table. The second trigger for Microsoft SQL Server is instead of update one. But here we have to mention one important thing. In order to create this trigger, you should disable Cascade Update on subscriptions foreign keys. That's extremely dangerous, extremely. And due to that danger, you have to modify the trigger to maintain referential integrity, so please do that yourself. For now, our trigger only does the following things. First, we have to check if the primary key of the table is being updated. If it is, we have to roll back the transaction, otherwise we cannot perform the update operation itself. Then we have to produce the list of records that violate that rule. And if that list is not empty, we have to produce the final information message, we have to print it, and we have to raise an error situation, but we shall not perform the transaction rollback here. And finally, we have to perform the update operation itself. In this block of code, we are once again checking for that condition, and if it's violated, we are modifying that date. And then we use that new value to perform the update operation. As usual, the solution for Oracle is the simplest. We have only one trigger that reacts both to insert and update operations. Inside the trigger body, for each row, we have to check for that condition, and if that condition is violated, we have to produce new value for subscriptions and date, we have to produce an information message and print that message, and then we have to use this value to perform the operation of either insertion or update. Finally, there's a reminder, please test all those triggers performing corresponding SQL queries.